I received an email the other day asking me to do a video on the economic crisis happening right now in Sri Lanka. And shamefully, the first thing I thought was, wait, there's a crisis? Current events have sucked the air out of other things going on around the world. As it turns out, this is one of them. Sri Lanka's economic development has been closely studied for decades. These recent events are adding a bitter new page to its history. In this video, we're going to look at the roots and causes of the ongoing economic crisis in Sri Lanka. But first, the Asianometry Patreon. I'll make it quick. Early access members get to see new videos and selected references for them before they're released to the public. I get a lot of requests for future videos, but occasionally I've already done those topics. They're just waiting to be released. It's not a lot of money, and I appreciate the support. Thanks, and on with the show. Sri Lanka, once known as Ceylon, had been a British colony for over 150 years. When the country received its independence in 1948, it had a lot going for it. The island held a strategic trading port location, and it had suffered no infrastructure damage from World War II. In terms of education and population health, the country ranked very well, too. And in terms of political governance, Sri Lanka was a democracy with universal suffrage, one that others pointed to as a model to follow. The former British colony also inherited a highly productive export economy. Sri Lankan plantations specialized in tea, rubber, and coconuts. In 1950, Sri Lanka's GNP, adjusted for purchasing power parity, was higher than that of India, Pakistan, Thailand, and even South Korea. By 1960, the country's per capita gross income of $141 was still much higher than Thailand's $96 and Indonesia's $50, and on par with South Korea's $156. An advisor to the Sri Lankan government in the late 1950s wrote that the country's single greatest challenge would be maintaining its current high living standards across a growing population. The development plan at the time focused on furthering the country's colonial-era successes and expanding its agricultural exports, mostly through infrastructure to improve the growing conditions in Sri Lanka's less populated dry zones. But this rosy picture hid a dangerous mix of flammable ingredients, and a number of fateful policy choices and uncontrollable events would ignite them, ending this early optimism. Sri Lanka has long been a multi-ethnic nation, dominated by two groups, the Sinhalese and the Tamils. The Sinhalese are majority Buddhists and speak Sinhala. The Tamils practice Hinduism and speak Tamil. These two ethnic groups are concentrated in separate parts of the nation. The Sinhalese, about 75% of the population, live in the south, west, and north central provinces. The Tamils, constituting about 13% of the country's population, live in the northern and eastern provinces. Their relations have historically been tense, with devastating consequences, but at the start of the 20th century, the two groups largely set aside their differences to struggle for independence from the British. The reality of the Sri Lankan constitution in 1948 was that it was not based on broad-based consensus between the various ethnicities, but rather through discussions between the Sinhalese elites and the colonial administrators. As a result, the Sri Lankan constitution failed to take into account the concerns of the ethnic minorities. The Tamils' objections were treated as obstructions in quote-unquote Ceylon's march to freedom. Half of the Tamil Legislative Council did not agree to the constitution, and the other half were voted out the next year. The first Sri Lankan general election brought a conservative party, the UNP, to power. They faced challenges from a Trotskyite left-wing party, the Lanka Sama Samaja Party. Inequalities between the people and the rise of communism led to the rising popularity of leftist ideologies. To contain them, the UNP implemented expensive food subsidies and passed legislation to disenfranchise Indian Tamils. These popular food subsidies were paid for by booming commodity prices from World War II and the Korean War. But when the Korean War ended, in 1953, commodity export revenues crashed, and the government found itself having to raise rice prices and other public services. The country's people rose up in protest, a traumatic event referred to as the Hartal. It forced the resignation of the prime minister and led to the UNP losing the general election 3 years later in 1956. This new government signaled a turn for the worse in relations between the Sinhalese and Tamil communities. Ethnic harmony was not a priority, a fateful decision. Various political parties abandoned their multi-ethnic stance. Sinhalese was instituted as the country's only official language. On the economic front, the government imposed import restrictions on consumer goods to conserve its limited foreign currency. The state then decided to establish monopolies to fulfill those import demands domestically. In other words, import substitution. There is a place for such policies. The East Asian giants, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, implemented them to help industrialize their economy. For example, in the 1970s, Taiwan and South Korea launched import substitution policies targeting the heavy and specialty chemical industries. These laid the groundwork for the two economies' future domestic success. But they have to be done in the right context and as part of a larger economic strategy. Whole textbooks have been written about such policies failing in South America. Taiwan and South Korea themselves tried import substitution 20 years earlier in the 1950s, targeting textiles and fertilizers to conserve foreign exchange and protect domestic industry. And in both cases, the policies failed to achieve the targeted growth rates. Foreign exchange reserves did not increase, while close relations between businessmen and the government led to corruption. So without needed reforms, these policies can be damaging. In Sri Lanka, wide-ranging import substitution policies led to inefficiencies, as the government tried to do everything themselves. Their domestic products cost more, as import demand simply shifted from imported finished goods to imported raw materials. Price shocks in raw goods, like during the oil crises of the 1970s, thus filtered down to the finished goods. By the 1970s, Sri Lanka had turned from a relatively open, market-based economy into one of the most closed, non-communist economies in the world. Economic growth dramatically slowed, and the country's development fell behind that of its peers. By 1977, Sri Lankan per capita income was $200, up just $60 from 1960, 17 years earlier. To compare, South Korea per capita income was $820, Malaysia $930, Thailand $420, and Indonesia $300. Sri Lanka's plantation economy, its crown jewel, fell into disarray. The government had been threatening to nationalize these British-owned assets ever since 1958, so the foreign companies stopped investing in them, and they declined until the actual event occurred in the 1970s. The sector continued to decline, with operations overseen by 6 ministries with overlapping powers and conflicting concerns. The government became the country's employer of last resort, doubling its GDP share from 1961 and providing over 50% of the country's manufacturing jobs. This was unfortunate because higher education exam policies, public sector employment, and more favored the Sinhalese elites. This unequal scenario bred radical ideologies amongst the minority Tamil youth. The sluggish economic growth finally built up the political will to change this welfare state-like status quo. 1977 saw a change in government and an attempt at reform and opening up. The new regime wanted to attract foreign investors and establish a labor-intensive export development economy. They established free trade zones, built in guarantees against nationalization of assets without compensation, devalued the currency, and attempted to limit state participation into the wider economy. The country even managed to reduce the rice subsidy, long a taboo subject in Sri Lankan politics. This was a prime window of opportunity. Sri Lanka was trying to open up before China and many other Asian nations could. The international community praised the country's turn in direction and sent unprecedented amounts of foreign aid. Growth surged from 2.9% a year before 1977 to 6% in a brief 5-year period from 1977 to 1983. Garment exports surged from 2% to 16% of the economy's total exports. Tourists more than doubled from 1.9 million in 1978 to 4 million in 1982, nearly tripling the amount of foreign exchange. However, that same 1977 election had also swept the Tamils into power on a platform calling for an independent Tamil state. And unfortunately, the government did not properly calibrate for the initial downside effects of their liberalization drive. Its effects hit the poorest members of the community hardest, with inflation, the removal of food subsidies, and the lifting of trade protections on certain farmed goods. The government failed to properly use the money it got from subsidies and foreign aid. Money was wastefully funneled to loss-making state-owned zombie companies to keep them alive. And mega infrastructure projects like a brand new capital and a house building program did not quite make sense. Things had already been precarious, but the worsening conditions set off a wildfire. The 1977 government had long shown authoritarian tendencies. Their heavy-handed tactics against Tamil protests set off a cycle of violence and retaliation that spiraled out of control. The Tamils' militant wings consolidated into an organization called the LTTE. Then, in July 1983, an event referred to as Black July, an LTTE attack on the security forces led to a brutal anti-Tamil pogrom across much of the country. Thus, the country fell into chaos. Supported by donations from the Tamil diaspora around the world, the LTTE established a de facto state in the north and eastern provinces of the country. The brutal war saw several pauses, but would not finally end until 2009. Despite the civil war, the government continued their opening up, with an eye towards building a labor-intensive export industry, following the standard playbook set down by other Asian economies. Some loss-making SOEs, like the textile mills, were privatized or closed down. Certain free trade privileges were expanded beyond the free trade zones. Interestingly, this reform drive continued despite a new center-left government, the People's Alliance, taking power from the UNP in 1994. The People's Alliance had campaigned on a strongly populist platform, threatening a return to the 1960s, but moderated their rule and continued the market-based reforms upon actually coming to power. Manufacturing gained prominence, finally ending the country's historical dependence on its plantation agricultural center. Garments, rubber-based products, and gems are some of the top manufactured items exported. Sri Lanka's textile and garment industry is especially strong and globally competitive. Responsible for a majority of its exports, the industry has attracted named customers like Abercrombie & Fitch, Banana Republic, Victoria's Secret, and more. Sri Lankan apparel firms have since incorporated advanced digital design techniques and begun evolving into multinationals of their own, establishing centers in India, Bangladesh, and beyond. So, despite an ongoing civil war, the economy grew at about 5% a year, and the number of people living in poverty declined from 29% in 1995 to 15% in 2006. There were some notable misses, however, due to the war. Motorola and Harris Corporation came to Sri Lanka in the early 1980s with the goal of building an assembly plant, but departed to Malaysia due to political instability. Considering the bustling electronics assembly industry centered in Penang today, it was a big loss for Sri Lanka. In 2007, a new administration came to power led by the current Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa. His government won critical defectors from the LTTE, gathered massive support from various countries, China in particular, and then led a massive military campaign that finally defeated the LTTE. He finally brought peace to a war-weary country. This decisive victory allowed the then president the opportunity to cement his power. He called for snap elections and amended the constitution to greatly expand his executive powers. Facing first the turbulence of high energy prices and then the chaos of the global financial crisis, the government began emphasizing its role in, quote, guiding the economy, end quote, to deal with the negative effects of globalization. In 2012, the government reimposed export tariffs on tea and rubber, with the goal of once more encouraging domestic processing, import substitution. This has represented a reversal from 30 years of trade liberalization policy and opening up. The reversal is surprising considering Rajapaksa was a key member of the People's Alliance. But despite this turn away from economic liberalization, the 5 years after the end of the Civil War saw the Sri Lankan economy growing very well. GDP grew 7% a year. The Sri Lankan stock market boomed. Per capita income grew from about $1,000 in 2004 to $3,200 in 2013. Inflation fell from a high of 22% in 2008 to a low of 3.17% in 2014. Unemployment halved from 8% in 2004 to 4% in 2013, and poverty rates declined from 15% to 6%. On the surface, these are great numbers. It portrays a country hitting its stride and enjoying its peace dividend. By 2019, Sri Lanka had become an upper-middle income country. Yet underneath this rosy picture, there were signs that this boom wasn't necessarily healthy growth. First, the main drivers behind this growth did not look sustainable. 70% of the real GDP increase from 2004 to 2013 came not from labor-intensive manufacturing, but rather debt-fueled major public sector construction and infrastructure. Sri Lanka regularly runs fiscal deficits. They have repeatedly breached deficit reduction agreements with the IMF, but their annual debt to GDP ratios have steadily increased since 2012. In 2019, it hit a 10-year high of nearly 87%, fueled by a massive tax cut brought in by incoming President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Mahinda's younger brother. These mega projects include the massive Colombo Port City project, a city of the future built on top of reclaimed land. The project is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative and has a budget of over $15 billion. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with debt, especially if it is appropriately used and spent on productive items. But the economic viability for these projects are questionable. Colombo Port City, for instance, is in the south, far away from Sri Lanka's war-torn northern and eastern provinces. It is close to the current government's political power base, however. Furthermore, these projects show signs of corruption, with billions of dollars of no-bid contracts and rates of increase correlating with those found in other countries known for high corruption. However, I do want to add that I don't really buy the claims of Chinese debt trap diplomacy. Just about 10% of Sri Lanka's total debt is owed to China. The vast majority is owed to the international bond markets. There are some concerns of 99-year leases and whatnot, but I won't address those here. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's traditional economic drivers have been shunted aside. Manufacturing as a share of GDP reached a peak of nearly 20% in the early 2000s, but since then it has trended downwards to 15% in the years thereafter. And the manufacturing that has grown has been focused on servicing the domestic sector, food, beverage, and tobacco, rather than export-oriented industries like garments or electronics. Compare this with Vietnam, which embarked upon its manufacturing push much later, but has overtaken Sri Lanka in terms of market share amongst manufacturing in the developing countries. Domestic dissatisfaction has increased. With employment once more dependent on how good your standing is with the government, many Sri Lankans have gone overseas to find work. The UN estimated that nearly 2 million Sri Lankans work abroad as migrant workers, with 100 to 200,000 more leaving each year. It's hard to take the low unemployment rate at face value when so many Sri Lankans are opting to head for the exits. Their remittances have become a major economic driver, representing 68% of the country's economy. It's the second biggest earner of foreign income after exports and a critical crutch. In 2019, the $6.7 billion of remittances migrant workers sent back to the home country covered over 85% of the country's forex shortfalls. The Sri Lankan economy's shift from manufacturing to debt-funded infrastructure, with supports from remittances, reduced its resiliency against external shock, a shock that arrived with the pandemic. In 2020, the pandemic arrived at Sri Lanka's shores with big impacts on the country's economic drivers, especially those generating the majority of its foreign exchange. Garment, tea, and rubber exports to locked-down countries in India, Europe, and the United States quickly declined. The Sri Lankan Export Development Board had expected 2020 to deliver some $18.5 billion in export earnings. In the end, total exports were $11 billion. Foreign remittances drastically declined. Pandemic lockdowns in countries like South Korea and Qatar meant that workers weren't working. Reductions in international travel have also affected workers' ability to travel abroad, adding further downward pressure. The decline in travel has also hurt tourism. Sri Lanka's tourism industry experienced double-digit growth as Chinese tourism boomed after the civil war ended and had become the country's third biggest foreign exchange earner after exports and remittances. But the pandemic, coming on after a series of suicide bombings in 2019 at various luxury hotels in Colombo, caused tourism to plummet. In 2018, 2.5 million tourists visited Sri Lanka, bringing in $5.6 billion in foreign exchange earnings. 2020, just 500,000 tourists came, and earnings declined by 80%. With their second and third largest foreign currency generators now crippled, the government sees import substitution of items like fertilizer as key towards preserving the remaining foreign reserves, but that in turn leads to domestic shortages, power cuts, rationing, and inflation. The Sri Lankan rupee has seen a substantial drop in value against the US dollar since March 2022, worsened by extensive money printing. Without access to foreign currency, or I guess crypto, people's hard-earned savings will vanish and return them to poverty. They're not going to take that lying down. The economic hardship has been a long time coming. COVID might have contributed the final push, but the country has been on the brink for a very long time. More than a few people have made the connection between what is going on right now in Sri Lanka with the ongoing financial crisis in the Lebanon. I echo those thoughts as well. And like in the Lebanon, the way out of the crisis starts with coherent political leadership. The government is in a bit of a deadlock, having recently lost their 2/3 parliamentary majority, but unable to work with the opposition. The government needs to restructure its debt, bring itself back onto the pathway towards economic reform, and improve its relations with the people. Such an effort starts from the very top. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the newsletter, and I'll see you guys next time.